And thank you to all of you for taking your lunch break to listen to me just talk and talk and talk. So I'll try to keep it interesting. And what I'm going to do is I'll make my presentation, and then we'll have questions and answers afterwards. And hopefully, you won't feel at all ashamed to ask any questions, because I'm sure that there will be a number of them. So I'm going to be talking about what will drive tomorrow's semiconductors. First of all, I'll just talk about, who am I? Who's this guy who's in front of you? And, I am a long-standing memory industry analyst. I never thought that I'd be an industry analyst for this large of a chunk of my career, but I actually started this in 1991. I joined DataQuest, which later got acquired by Gartner Group, thinking that this would be a good place to look for my next job. Before that, I was working for a memory manufacturer by the name of IDT, and decided that I didn't want to work in Salinas for the rest of my career, that I wanted to move back up here, and came to work for DataQuest and found out that it was a good fit. But I joined DataQuest, which then later got taken over by Gartner. For a brief stint during the internet bubble, I joined a flash memory firm, SST, that some of you may have heard of. It's now a part of Microchip. And then when the downturn happened, I ended up having to look for a job, and I went to Semico Research, worked there for 4 years, and then finally went to Objective Analysis, a firm that I formed with 2 other industry analysts who I worked with at Gartner. I've been in the semiconductor industry for a number of years, and Stefan mentioned a number of these companies. But also I'm the blogger for the Memory Guy, the SSD Guy. I've written some stuff for Forbes and for EE Times. I also write for a blog for the financial community that you have to pay to read. Believe it or not, there are blogs like that. It's called Smart Karma. So I do a lot of that. I also do an awful lot of consulting with the financial community to explain to people how not to lose a lot of money during semiconductor cycles. And I'm going to be talking a lot about semiconductor cycles during this. This is just a kind of an advertisement. This is the company, Objective Analysis, the 3 of us, and the things that we do. And I'm just going to, leave that up for the minimum amount of time. But something that we're really proud of is our ability to forecast accurately. And so this is something that we put up on our website that, as far as I know, there's no other semiconductor forecaster who is willing to go back and put 10-year-old forecasts in front of people and say, here's how we did. But this is a report card for us. So each one of these red figures that's on the left-hand side, the year, that is a hot link to a videotape of me giving the next year's forecast. VLSI Research has been very nice about recording these forecasts for all of this time and comparing them to their own forecasts. And they just leave those up on the web. So if you click on any of those, if you go to our website, you go to the forecast accuracy page, and you click on any of those years, then you'll be taken to a recording where you can watch year after year how much grayer my hair gets. But what's interesting is if you go to the 2016, which was actually videotaped in November of 2015, and you go 19 minutes into the forecast, into the video, because these are all about 20-minute videos, then you'll see me saying that 2018 is going to be the year when the downturn starts for the memory industry. So we see it as a very predictable kind of a thing. And even though some of these numbers might be a little bit off, in general, we've got a good feel for this. And so we're expecting to see the market go down 5% this year after having had 14% growth, which was just announced this week by WSTS, but 14% growth in 2018. So here's what I'm going to talk about. First, I'll talk briefly about chip applications. And then, as I said before, I'm going to be getting into the semiconductor cycle and actually talking about what the semiconductor cycle is, how it performs, and how to use that to predict how the semiconductor market is going to go. And then I'll talk a little bit about tomorrow's chips, new technologies, and give an outlook for what we expect to see in the marketplace. So let's go to our chip applications first. There's a lot of stuff happening in the market right now, and so I say that the market's at a nexus. There are a lot of changes going on. There's PM, persistent memory, and that's something that Intel is trying to drive. They're calling their 3D crosspoint memory. 3D crosspoint offers 2 advantages. in being able to build a memory for a system. One is that it gives you a very large memory for cheap. It's a little bit slow, but it's really cheap. And so I'm expecting for the first applications to use that the same way that a lot of applications have used NAND flash to be able to reduce the amount of DRAM that's in the system when they put in an SSD. Another thing is the Internet of Things. People have been talking about it for a long time. This is one of those kinds of applications where I'm expecting to see people talk about it, and all of these Internet of Things applications will pop up without really calling themselves things, and eventually we'll say, oh yeah, there's this application for security systems, and there's an application for medical monitoring and that kind of stuff, and we won't call them Internet of Things application, but they will actually fit into this category, and that's all happening right now too. And then there's artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is really interesting because it counts on an awful lot of processing steps that are not as well done by conventional von Neumann computers, the 8086 type processors or whatever, as they are done by today by DSP chips, or even better, by graphics processing engines. But that's not the best way to do artificial intelligence, and I'll talk about what the future way is towards the end of the slideshow of what the new thinking is about how to do artificial intelligence. I don't have quantum computing on here because that's not something that's going to happen anytime soon. But everything is changing. And so, you know, I'm sure that you always hear about that, everything is changing. It changes slowly enough that we don't really see it happening in our times. But if you step back to where you were in high school, or what your parents did when they were your age, or your grandparents did when they were your age, and you look at what their lives were like, there's been an awful lot of change. And this is the same kind of thing that we're going to continue to have, nothing standing still. There's a constant worry about what's going to happen with semiconductors is if we want to set out to build, you know, let's just say, 20 terabyte or 20 terabit NAND flash chip. You know, today that looks absolutely impossible. Probably if you look at this video in 10 years, you'll say that's possible, and if you look in 20 years ago, you'll say that what a ridiculous guy. But the worry is nobody will ever be able to build something that's that incredibly huge. And then the other is, if we do build it, nobody will use it. There's a story I like to tell about this, and that is that in the 1980s, I worked for a gentleman at IDT, Bob Cushman, who I went to him and talked about the problems that we were having bringing out a 1 megabit SRAM. It was, you know, it was like 2 years late. It was a real problem. And then I said, I don't even know who's going to use this thing. And he said, well, back in the 70s, I used to work at Electronic Arrays. And we brought out a memory chip. It was a mask ROM, and it was so dense, we didn't think there'd be an application that could possibly use it. It was 16 kilobits. You know, you look at that and you say, okay, everybody's always going to worry about this, is are we producing more transistors than the industry can possibly use? And we're not. It's just, if we build it, somebody will figure out how to use it, especially if it's really cheap. And that's semiconductors. Semiconductors are always really cheap. So the reality, too, is that Moore's Law is not dead. Moore's Law has died a number of times. I actually wrote a blog post from something that an Intel fellow shared with me back in 2011. I think I put it in Forbes. And it was something about how Moore's Law was supposed to be dead at whatever, 90 nanometers, and then at 45 nanometers and whatever. And then she listed, this is Intel fellow, Kellen Kuhn, I think is her name, and she shared what the new inventions were that allowed the industry to get past that. One that Samsung's really good at, that is happening right now, is 3D NAND. We ran into a problem where you couldn't possibly scale transistors smaller than 15 nanometers and be able to use them for NAND flash. The floating gate just wouldn't work, couldn't be made to work smaller than that. And you know, how are you going to take it down to 10, 7 nanometers or whatever? Well, you didn't. You went to 3D. And so this is just another way that Moore's Law, which says the number of transistors on a chip will double every year or two, that ended up being followed even so. And so there are other technologies that are probably going to use that. The constant cost reductions in this industry cause new applications to happen. And so things that weren't cost effective years ago should be cost effective in the future. But we never really know what tomorrow is going to bring in the future. But the bright lights as far as applications go right now are autonomous vehicles. Everybody's paying a lot of attention to those. And I think that we will probably get to a point where the technology is there, and then will the insurance companies put up with this uncertainty about who's responsible for this? We've got virtual reality and augmented reality. This is very close to home for me. I've got a son who's 29 years old who works in the video gaming industry. And this is just exciting as all get out for him, is how do you incorporate this into something that gamers can use? But also a lot of people are looking at it and saying, how can you turn it into something that is useful for many more applications too? My son has an acute awareness of this because he gets car sickness. And virtual reality is really known for being able to throw your perspective and do that. So, he probably will offer some way of bringing something into it. He works for Game Grumps, by the way. I don't know if you've ever heard of them. Internet of Things. That's one of the things that I said is the application on there, and it's bringing things. I've got a Ring doorbell in my home. A lot of you probably have Nest thermostats. I found out my garage door opener, which I just had to replace recently, can be accessed by Wi-Fi, and so somebody in Russia, if they hack my garage door opener, can make that open and close and open and close. I don't think anybody's going to waste any time learning how to do that, though. Drones. We watched the Super Bowl on Sunday. And during the halftime show, there was a singer, and there were all of these Intel quadcopters with flashing lights of different colors on them, making all kinds of, spelling out different words in the sky and that kind of stuff. It's like a replacement for fireworks. That takes a whole lot more sophistication than anybody thought would be possible about, 15 years ago. And robotics. Are these robots going to be autonomous? I see your security robots that you have out here. People will probably look at those sometime in the future and say, boy, those are big. Why don't they use these small things that we have now? And then personal fitness monitors, those are an important thing now, but as we get to the point where they can measure more things like blood sugar, they'll become just incredibly important. I'm also expecting from some of the work that's being done at IMEC, the university consortium in Belgium that Samsung is a member of, I see them putting together things that are prototypes for bandages, where you'll go to the doctor's office, the doctor will put a bandage on your chest and say, don't take that off for 3 days. Download this app on your phone, and then I'll watch whatever it is, function of your body for those days, and I'll tell you later on whether or not you need to come in for a follow-up visit. That kind of thing is going to happen, and that's going to be a thing, but nobody's going to call it that. So let's talk a little bit about semiconductor cycles. Now that we know that there's going to be an awful lot of demand, and we know, take it on me, that Moore's Law is going to continue, then how is the industry going to react to this from a business standpoint? One thing that I find very interesting is that if you take memory growth, which is across the bottom here, and you plot it against growth of the total semiconductor market, that you end up with this scatter plot that is really very tightly clustered around here. And this is the way that objective analysis builds its forecasts, is we say if we understand what memories are going to do, then we can put together a pretty good forecast about what the entire semiconductor market is going to do. The outliers that you see here, something very interesting about most of them is that they're during the time that Japan was entering the market. And I haven't yet figured out why that would be. But whatever the reason, they're all in the 1980s. And then you've got that one way up to the right. And if you were to extend that black orb up there, it would be in line with the orb. So it was just a phenomenal, just amazing year, 150% memory revenue growth in 1 year. But it was something predictable. So that's how we build a semiconductor forecast. We build it based on memory revenues. This is DRAM revenues from 1991 to 2017, I think it is on this, and NAND flash revenues from 2004 when WSTS first started reporting NAND as separate from flash. You look at that and you say, okay, who can predict anything like that? This is just absolute, it's a mess. It's chaos. But it ends up not being that difficult to predict, even though it looks that bad. And these cycles are very strong, and people say, yeah, there won't be a cycle this time, but we're going to be stuck with cycles for a long time. What's interesting is that the demand is not at all that way. This is gigabyte shipments. The same history, 1991 through the present for DRAM, and 2004 to the present for NAND flash. And you look at those, and there are some wiggles. As a matter of fact, I haven't looked to see whether or not there's a laser pointer on this thing. Okay, so if you look over here at 2008, 2009, when we had the last big financial collapse, then you can see there's a little bit of a bump down in NAND flash and in DRAM. That was a huge difficulty that the industry faced, but still it only caused something that was kind of a little bump in the greater scheme of things. You look here at 2001, the internet bubble burst, you see a little bit of a bump down. But other than that, there are a few irregularities. But memory, as a general rule, grows at a steady pace. That can only happen if the suppliers can supply the product and if demand stays really healthy. And so demand stays very healthy for this. And so one of the things that we do to predict what the semiconductor market's going to do in the future is we say, well, if growth has been pretty smooth in the past, it's going to be pretty smooth in the future. And we just say that's the shortcut to producing a good forecast, is to look and not say we're going to see demand just drop, disappear. We're going to see demand come back up again. It's roughly going to follow a straight line on this curve. Something I didn't say, and something that I do very often, you'll probably catch me at it here, is I'm using a semi-logarithmic chart. So this thing goes in powers of 10 up the y-axis. A semi-logarithmic chart, it's a magical thing. It turns constant growth into a straight line. So if I were to put these numbers on a linear chart, you'd end up with something that hugged the bottom all the way out to 2011 and then all of a sudden zoomed way up. It wouldn't really tell you much of anything. But on a semi-logarithmic chart, then constant growth is a straight line. The growth for each one of these technologies has been slowing. You can see because they curve. And so NAND flash growth early on in this chart was over 100% per year. That meant every year more bits shipped that year than in all of history combined. As things slowed down, it got down to where it is right now, about 45% per year. DRAM's growth back in the middle 90s was about 75% per year. It's now down to about 25% per year. You'll have occasions when the growth is lower than that because of inventory burn-off, and where growth is higher than that because of people building inventory, but it all centers around about 25% per year. So you say 25% per year growth, that tells you how many gigabytes are going to sell. How do you get to revenues? You do it by multiplying it times price. So that's, I forgot my lead into this, but you know, if you've got this very bumpy revenue that's driven by very smooth growth in consumption, then how do you end up getting the revenue so bad off because of that? You know, why is revenue so bumpy when you've got such smooth growth? And that's because of pricing. So this, once again, is a semi-logarithmic chart, price per gigabyte for DRAM. And you look at it, and that's really bumpy. You multiply this times the constant growth in bits, and you end up with the wildly fluctuating revenues. This, though, is predictable. So here's your price, and then this is an approximation of cost. I went back to DataQuest numbers back in the 1990s, and these were DataQuest numbers for the 20 years before that, where somebody had collected cost numbers that had been shared by DRAM manufacturers back in those days. I haven't been able to find anybody who'd be willing to do that these days, but back then they did it. And I worked all of these numbers together, how many units shipped of this device, and figured out what the average cost was, and it ended up being a straight line. So here I've got a straight line, which is just an approximation that I use now. It represents Moore's law, roughly. And you can see with rare exceptions, prices stay above that line. This particular time here in 2001 was a time when products sold below cost. That triggers trade sanctions. And so the United States government got very aggressive against DRAM manufacturers during that time because of the fact that products were being sold below cost. That happened in Europe too. As a general rule, companies stay above cost. And so what the cycle is for these prices is that you have flat prices during a shortage, and you can see where other shortages are. that the prices went flat. And then when the market tips into an oversupply, then the prices collapse down to cost. You see you've got collapses here. And then once they've hit cost, because of the fact that they won't be going below it for the threat of trade sanctions, then you have them following cost. And so those are the three phases of semiconductor marketing. All you have to do then is just say, okay, figure out when they're going to be oversupplies and when they're going to be shortages, and then estimate that during the oversupplies, things will either fall to cost or they'll be at cost. And during the shortages, the prices will level off and profits will grow. So that is a semiconductor cycle. And it's a very simple thing. It always happens. And it's true of any commodity. It happens with wheat or rice. It happens with steel or concrete. It even happens with shipping lines and airlines. Is when you've got a shortage, then prices stabilize or even go up. It's pretty amazing what happened last year, how much DRAM prices went up. When that happens, then they're big profits, and the manufacturers overinvest in their capacity. And then when they overinvest, it takes about 2 years for that capacity to come into full volume production. And so that capacity, once it comes into full volume production, causes an oversupply to happen. That causes prices to collapse, and the profits vanish from the marketplace. Without profits, manufacturers can't invest in new capacity, and so they don't. And then for a while, this constantly growing demand grows into the size of the capacity, and it causes another shortage. The shortage drives profits. The manufacturers get profitable again, they overinvest, and you just keep going around the circle. It's generally 2 years up, 2 years down, unless there's some external event like the global financial collapse in 2008, or like other countries entering the marketplace. This is an idealized version of how that all happens. So this red line is like what I was showing you with the DRAM and NAND flash gigabyte growth. This is a similar kind of a thing, but I just drew a straight line just to kind of illustrate how the cycle works. And so you've got demand growing constantly through all these years. You've got supply coming on in stair steps, that when there are high profits, then supply is added. When there are no profits, no supply is added on. And so sometimes the stair steps go underneath the demand line. That causes a shortage. Other times the stair steps go above the demand line. That causes an oversupply. And if you can call when those oversupplies and shortages are going to happen, then you know what the market's going to do. So I'm going to change gears radically before I bring you to the forecast, and I'll talk about what chips we see coming tomorrow. And I'll talk a little bit about a report that we recently authored on that too. So here you've got all of these different memory technologies. The ones that are the most well-known are MRAM, which is a magnetic RAM, and it actually uses magnetism on the chip. It puts on a special magnetic layer that then acts like a magnetic disk or magnetic tape or something like that. You've got resistive RAM, and that's actually a bigger category than a lot of people give it credit for. It's anything that uses resistance to tell whether or not a bit is set. It's low resistance, then the bit is set. If it's a high resistance, then it's a 0. And then phase change memory is arguably a resistive RAM. 3D Crosspoint is one of these kinds of memories. And it uses a material from a chemist's or a physicist's view, it's phase changes. The phases are solid, liquid, and gas. And this material that it uses is a solid, which, according to these people, who look at it this way, a solid is crystalline. If it's not crystalline, then it's a liquid. And so this material, even though it appears solid to you and me, here's an example, is window glass. To somebody who's a chemist or somebody who's a physicist, window glass is a liquid because it is not crystalline. And if you go into a really old building and you look through the windows, you'll notice that the glass bulges down at the bottom. That's because over 200 years or 300 years, the glass has actually moved very slowly down the window. So this phase change memory uses a material that's like glass. It's called a chalcogenide glass, which I have a real problem saying. And this kind of glass, if you melt it and then freeze it quickly, it stays amorphous, And if you melt it and you freeze it slowly, then it goes crystalline. When it's crystalline, it conducts electricity. When it's amorphous, then it's an insulator. That's what Intel's using for their 3D crosspoint. They can switch it in something like 30 nanoseconds from a 1 to a 0. So even though it sounds like a slow process, it's not. And then you've got ferroelectric memory. This was actually something that was used very early on in technology. It has no iron in it, even though it's got the word ferro in it. And the reason why it's called ferroelectric is because of its behavior, that it behaves like magnetic tape or any other kind of magnetic recording, that if you push it so that it's in one direction, then when you remove the pushing force, it stays in that direction. So it's like pushing it to the north pole and then taking away the magnet, then it ends up staying north, magnetized. It's like that, but it actually does that electrically. And it does it by moving atoms around inside a crystalline structure. Ferroelectric memories, people hated ferroelectric memories. They worked okay, and Fujitsu made tons of them for subway fare cards. But the ferroelectric memory that was used in those days used lead. And anybody who works in a fab hates lead, because lead ions, once they get out, they contaminate everything that they're near. They found out in 2011 that hafnium oxide, which everybody uses in their logic processes nowadays, advanced logic processes, hafnium oxide is a really great ferroelectric material. They didn't know that before. And so now all of a sudden everybody's interested in that again. There are all of these other things, carbon nanotubes and polymeric memories and that kind of stuff. Too many of them to list. But what's interesting about all of these is that they're all non-volatile memories. They are not like DRAM. They don't lose their bits when the power goes out. And so this changes the way that computers are going to be built in the future, because if DRAM is replaced by a persistent memory, then we're going to end up having computers that no longer have to store stuff on the disk in case the power goes out. A lot of research is going on with these, and a few weeks ago I attended the IEEE conference called IEDM. It's the International Electron Device Meeting. It's up in San Francisco, and it's really, really technical papers. Most of them go over my head, but these papers ended up being something that was worth my going to listen to. And so this is just a tally of all of the papers for all of the different technologies. What's interesting is that the papers that got the most attention, the one that we had most papers for, were neural networks and ferroelectric memory. So as I said, ferroelectric memory is really gaining a big following. MRAMs had a conference of their own after this one, and so there were 10 more presentations, although some of them were repeats. Well, that brings the number of MRAM papers up to 23. So it's still not as big as FRAM, but it's still a really big thing. And a lot of people think that MRAM is the thing that's going to be used in the future for logic processes, for the memory and logic processes. There was a lot of ReRAM activity there, and then finally, what's interesting is even though the reason why all of these emerging memories are popular is because of the fact that people think flash is going to die on logic chips, there were still nine papers for flash, people talking about how to build flash in a FinFET process, which is something that people used to think a few years ago would be impossible. So there's a lot of research going on in all of these technologies. It's way too early to tell which one's going to win. I told you early on that I talked to a lot of investors, and all these investors say, so where should I put my money, MRAM or FRAM or whatever? I say, I can't tell. And they go away disappointed, but that's about the best that I can do for them. So this is the pretext that everybody uses for why new memory is needed. And this is why they've been able to get funding for a long time. This is once again a semi-logarithmic chart. You've got just kind of an abstract representation. I actually put this chart together in, I think, 2007. But it shows the relative costs of flash versus a new technology if they're both using the same process node across the bottom. And this does the same thing as that price-cost chart that I showed before, that it's just a straight line for what the cost would be to manufacture. Now, the assumption I used for this chart was that the new technology's wafer would cost twice as much to build as the flash technology's wafer, which is, we don't know. It could be that it's 1.5 times or something like that, but whenever it's new, it's going to cost more to manufacture. But once you get to wherever it is, where you can't make the bits any smaller in flash anymore. And back in 2006, I said this was something like, 10 nanometers, and it ended up being 15. Then, no matter how tight you make the process after that, then the process, the price, or the manufacturing cost, I should say, for the flash is going to be the same, no matter what the process is. And so that's where the new technology takes over, is that even though the new technology's wafer cost is higher than the flash's wafer cost, because of the fact that its bits scale smaller than the flash's bits, then its cost will continue to scale. And after about 2 process generations, then the new technology should be able to get cheaper than flash and then go on from there. Now, over the course of history, people have said planar NAND or planar flash is not going to be able to scale. And they got down to a certain size, and somebody said, well, what if we use a cap cell structure? What if we wrap the top plate around the bottom plates? And they did that. They were able to get it a few more generations. And what if we ended up using higher K dielectrics? And they did that. That ended up getting them a few more generations. And so this constantly is, the knee and the curve kept on moving. But we've finally gotten to that point with logic transistors and with standard NOR, and so now the question is, how do we go from there? We'll use one of these new technologies. But there's something else that's really cool that these new technologies do, and that is that they're resistors. Even an MRAM is a resistor inside, and with a resistor, you can change the amount of resistance that you've got linearly. And so AI people are looking at this, and they're saying, that's really cool. If we've got an array, just this big bunch of resistors, and this is very similar to a memory structure, and we put a different voltage on each one of the word lines of the memory, and those voltages are driven by external sources. They could be bits on a CCD camera or something like that. And if each one of these voltages comes in and hits a resistor, the voltage that comes out of one of the bit lines is going to be a function of the resistor times each one of the voltages. So what you get is, all at once, this line is the sum of the product of all of the resistors that are in there. Now that's something that's a function that AI does a lot. What's even more interesting is that you're not just doing it for this bit column, you're doing it for every bit column in the entire array at the same time. And so because of that, you end up getting, in a 64 kilobit array, a little teeny tiny array, you get 256 sums, each of which has 256 multiplies. And I say it all happens in a single cycle. This is going to be a very slow cycle, but still, if you look at how long it takes for a conventional processor to accomplish all of this, and how much silicon area is required, how much cost, this ends up being a very inexpensive alternative. And so in the future, we're expecting to see a lot more use of this concept that right now is just beginning to see the light of day. There are very few companies that are producing products like this. Something else that I didn't say, and I'll just back up again, is training these things is a whole lot easier than training a digital system too. When you're training it, you have to set each one of these resistors to the right value. Doing that in a conventional computing architecture involves doing an awful lot of iteration. When you do it with one of these, what you do is you drive the voltage backwards through here. Something proportional to what you want the output to be when you have this given set of inputs. And so training is trivial on these kinds of systems. And these systems, as a result, will be able to be adaptive neural processing systems. They're called neural network chips. And they'll really change the way that AI is done from how it is done today. And this is just an advertisement for a book that we came out with. Tom Coughlin, who spoke here a while ago, I think it was back in December, he also wrote this book with me, and it's just a focus on these emerging memory technologies. So, link there if you want to buy it, then it can be down there. So finally, what is our outlook for the marketplace? And this is the 3 different markets that we're expecting to see convert over to a new memory technology. So first I'll talk about new memories, and then I'll talk about the outlook based on semiconductor cycles. Logic, the top thing. This is the memory inside of foundry logic chips, like Samsung's foundries or any of the competitors that you guys have. Those chips, very slowly, the average process migrates over time. And so that means that early on, there will be some conversion of 10 nanometer processes, 7 nanometer processes to a new memory technology. And that might be MRAM, it might be something else. But whenever that does happen, that's going to open up a new opportunity, and then that opportunity will slowly ramp to become the dominant kind of memory in the semiconductor market. This isn't just for NOR flash that this is going to happen, but there are also supposed to be reasons why SRAM is something that people will want to replace inside the chips. So, we see this as going on in the future. This learning that goes on with this will help with the NAND flash market and the DRAM market. And so we're expecting to see changes happen there too. But changes in these markets happen much more rapidly than where they happen in the logic process. And it's just like if you took the average process node in a memory chip versus the average process node in logic, you'd find that it moved much faster in memories. And so we're expecting to see NAND flash at some point not be able to add layers. Samsung, as well as other companies, has said 500 plus layers is probably going to be achievable for NAND flash. But if you're doubling the layers every 2 years, which is the pace that we're on right now, eventually you're going to get to a point where there are just so many layers that it becomes an unmanageable mess. And so everybody is expecting for NAND flash not to go past a certain number of layers. 3 years ago, people were saying it was 100 layers. 5 years ago, people were saying it was 30 layers. So it's at 500 layers that people think is the limit now. I don't know where the limit is, but whenever that does happen, and I'm saying 2025 might be, then we'll change over. And resistive RAM looks like it might be a good candidate for this because it can adapt to the process, the vertical process that's already used for NAND flash. DRAM, the reason why DRAM has a changeover so late there is because there are a lot of materials that have not been tried for DRAM yet. High K dielectric materials that go up to numbers that are like 10 times the dielectric strength of what DRAMs use today. And so that could be used to shrink DRAM well down into the sub 10 nanometer area. And I'm expecting to see more advancements there. This industry continues to surprise me with how much creativity there is and how people are able to push out the inevitable death of things. And so, this is a current view. If you asked me to look at this slide 5 years from now, I'd probably be kind of embarrassed and move all of these things out further. As far as what we're thinking from a semiconductor cycle standpoint, this is our year-by-year forecast for the next few years. And this is a little bit of an old slide because 2018 is behind us, but we were calling for a mid-year NAND flash oversupply and then a collapse of NAND flash, followed in 2019 by a collapse of DRAM. These are following that price-cost curve that I showed you earlier on, where we saw the prices come down to cost, and so that will evaporate the profit margin in these businesses. Typically, there are 2 years in a down cycle. There's the year of the collapse, and then there's the year where everything follows cost, and so 2020 would typically be the second down year. Now, China's semiconductor investment initiative is aiming to make the company be a big supplier of NAND flash in 2020. We think they're going to miss that, but probably only by a year. And so even though they're supposed to come out in 2020, we think they'll come out in 2021, which normally by the semiconductor cycles would be an up year, but we're saying it's going to be a down year because of the fact that China has entered the marketplace. So given that scenario, then we don't see a recovery from the collapse that we're entering into right now until 2022, when we expect for demand to catch up with supply because of that stair step that I showed you, and then we'll end up seeing new profits. So I'm probably way ahead of time. So maybe you guys can have some playtime after listening to me drone on and on. But I'd be open to answering any questions about, what our outlook is for the future.
Well, thanks for your presentation. I have a question. I work on MRAM. So my question is, based on what you have observed, which company, which approach you think might have a chance to develop something competitive with DRAM in the future?
Competitive with DRAM, you said?
Yes.
MRAM is the one that everybody's looking at, and I think the reason why is because the MRAM cell structure is about the same size as a DRAM cell structure.
Ideally, if the minimum sized transistor can supply enough current to switch the magnetic a memory element, but the reality is not. I think the best which are being produced today is about maybe 30, 40, 50 F square. So it's a pretty big transistor right now.
Yeah, the people who make them tell me a very optimistic story. This is, Everspin, STT, and those. And
Everspin never disclosed their cell size, never ever.
Yeah. so without that, then it could be something else, resistive RAM, but resistive RAM is much slower than DRAM. And so
right. I think there are some company having the approach of using an isolator, like a switch plus a MTJ element. They marketed that as a 3D MRAM. But you look at what isolator switching element they use like an RRAM type of material. Then it has its own endurance problem. You cannot run many cycles. It has its own speed problem that degrades the performance to like storage class memory, not in the same regime of DRAM or SRAM. Yeah,
and if it's something that's a problem, and I hope I'm not getting too deep for you guys, but something that is a big problem is that if you have a two-terminal switch for something that requires the current to go in both directions inside, you end up, for power reasons, needing to use something that is very much like an RRAM, and so it wears out.
Right. The only possibility, the company which is closest in the smallest published cell size is by Toshiba and Hynix in South Korea. I think maybe a couple of years ago, they published the cell size of about 9F square. Right, compared to DRAM, maybe 6F square or smaller.
Yeah.
And I think, I've talked to some people there, they are continuing their approach to make a smaller transistor, but supply much more current, further shrink the cell size. Maybe that's the way to go.
Yeah, it's hard to tell. And I was very non-committal about which technology was going to win here because I don't know.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Not an economic question, but my question is, why is Intel so insistent that 3D XPoint is not phase change memory?
Okay, that is a good question, and I have to admit that I don't know the answer, but I think what they want to do is they want to distance themselves from phase change memory that both Samsung and Intel, and a little bit of ST Microelectronics too, introduced. Well, I guess it wasn't Intel at the time, it was Mnemonics, but they introduced a phase change memory and actually sold it and didn't have much market success. Samsung's only appeared in a certain Samsung cell phone for about a year. And the Intel part was probably shipped for about 4 years, but never really made anything in the marketplace. And I suspect that what they did is they said, this isn't good, we don't want to be associated with this, we'll call it something else. But in essence, it is the same thing. It does use a different selector mechanism than the diode that they were using before. It's now got a bidirectional selector that is based on the same phase change material or kind of material that they had before. But an antimony structure. But as far as why they'd call it that, I don't know.
All right, so this is an economic question. You characterize the market as a commodity and these inevitable boom and busts. Is there anything, either technology, economics, politics, that will change that?
I wish. And that's a wonderful question. I have spoken to people who understand non-semiconductor commodities, and a lot of people really don't like calling DRAM and NAND flash a commodity. Let me tell you what a commodity is by the definition that I use, which is a pretty common definition, and that is, if you don't care whose product you buy, but whoever sells you the cheapest product can be used, then it's a commodity. And so these things that I was naming before, concrete and weed and shipping lines, with all of those, if you had to ship thousands of tons of concrete down to Panama, then you'd probably take bids from all these different shipping lines, and you wouldn't care which shipping line took it down there for you. If you were in Panama and you needed to buy that concrete, you'd probably ask everybody who makes concrete to supply you a bid. You wouldn't care who that came from. And so the same thing is true with NAND flash. And this is part of the reason why Samsung has such a big focus on SSDs, is because SSDs are differentiated at least more than NAND flash chips. But with NAND flash chips, you buy a Samsung chip, and for some reason Samsung can't supply it to you. You just go over to SK Hynix and you say, please give me a chip, and they say fine, and you buy it from them. So that makes it a commodity. Commodities have what is called the commodity cycle, and things go up and down. I was in Korea in the late 1990s and read this wonderful newspaper article that I said, boy, that's like DRAM, where Korean farmers had noticed that there was a big shortage in, let's say, 1998 of onions, because China had this horrible, drought or something like that, and they needed onions. They bought all the onions on the Korean market. The Korean farmers all said, we'll plant onions next year. So they all planted onions the next year. China didn't have a problem that year, and so there was this big onion glut. Well, that's the same thing that is happening with DRAMs or anything else, is that if you have a delay between when you're responding to an event and when that event really happened, then that causes the cycle to really swing. The bigger the delay, the harder the swing. And if you could make things immediate, that an immediate change in capital spending had an immediate result in how much DRAM you produced, then the cycles wouldn't be as bad. But unfortunately, an $8 billion fab takes about 2 years to get into full volume production, and so you can't really do that. The one thing that would make it really nice for the vendors, but which is frowned upon because it was used so miserably in the United States against customers back in the early 1900s, the one thing is collusion or a monopoly. And these are things that are illegal in the United States, they're illegal in Europe, and the reason why is because we had Standard Oil in the United States going into a state, selling gasoline for cheaper than any of the local producers could, driving all of the local producers out of business, and then taking the market and raising it up again. And you can either do that by having a monopoly or selling below cost, or by getting certain competitors of yours to agree to the price and then not go below those prices. All of those things have been made illegal. And so because of that, then you can't control the cycle by controlling prices with your competitors or by doing a monopoly. So you can't do that. You've got the commodity nature of the business, and there's really no getting around it.